It was the summer of 1945, and Japan was burning. City after city, Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, had turned to ash under the relentless rain of American bombers. The skies glowed red each night as firestorms devoured entire neighborhoods, and the sound of falling walls echoed like thunder across the empire. But beneath the smoke, in deep underground chambers and quiet military offices, a different kind of fire was burning, one of secrecy, fear, and desperate curiosity. Japan's leaders knew something was coming, something beyond imagination, and yet, they did not understand how close the world was to ending. Before we dive into this untold story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us uncover the hidden truths and human stories buried beneath the ashes of World War II. Now, let's begin. By mid-1945, Japan was standing on the edge of extinction. Its navy had been shattered, its army trapped in distant islands, its people starving. Yet in the chaos, fragments of intelligence began to surface. Rumors of a weapon so powerful it could destroy an entire city in a single strike. American scientists, the reports whispered, were working on something called the super bomb. At first, Japan's high command dismissed it as propaganda, but then the whispers grew louder. Diplomatic cables intercepted from Berlin mentioned a new kind of explosive being tested in the United States. Even in the final months of the war, when communication with Germany had nearly collapsed, Japanese officers and scientists clung to these clues like ghosts of hope. Japan had its own atomic research program, known as NIGO. It was small, underfunded, and fragmented between the Army and Navy, but it was real. In Tokyo, at the Riken Institute, physicist Yoshio Nishina, one of Japan's most brilliant scientists and a close friend of Niels Bohr, was quietly conducting experiments on uranium enrichment. He understood the theory of nuclear fission. He knew what was possible. Yet without access to the massive industrial resources needed to separate uranium-235, his research remained confined to chalkboards and dreams. He warned the government that such a weapon could exist, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of war. And still, intelligence officers were listening. In early 1945, Japanese diplomatic agents in Stockholm and Berlin reported conversations suggesting that the Americans were preparing something of immense destructive power. One message even mentioned that the United States is developing a new bomb, one capable of releasing energy from within the atom. These reports made their way to the foreign ministry in Tokyo, then to the military. Some dismissed them as rumors, others as psychological warfare. But a few, quiet, skeptical minds began to wonder, what if it was true? The empire's fatal flaw was not ignorance, it was disbelief. Japan's leaders, steeped in centuries of warrior culture, believed in courage and sacrifice and spiritual power. They could not comprehend the weapon that rendered all that meaningless. To them, wars were fought with men and steel, with bayonets and planes, with spirit and endurance. The idea that a single bomb could erase all of that, the honor, the strategy, the sacrifice, was simply too foreign. In their hearts, they believed no weapon could replace the will to fight. In the summer of 1945, the war cabinet met almost daily in the underground shelters of Tokyo. The air above them was thick with ash, and the world they ruled was shrinking by the hour. Yet deep in those meetings, fragments of truth surfaced. Rumors from neutral countries hinted that the United States had tested a new kind of bomb in the desert. A Swedish intelligence cable described an explosion brighter than 1,000 suns. The Japanese ambassador in Moscow, Naotake Sato, sent warnings through encrypted channels. America, he said, was preparing something final. But when those messages reached Tokyo, they were quietly filed away. The government chose not to act. Some historians believe Japan did know. They argue that the empire scientists, through scattered fragments of intelligence, realized that the U.S. had mastered atomic fission, yet the military refused to believe it could be used in time to end the war. The irony is haunting. Japan's scientific community understood the danger, but their government ignored them. In that silence, millions of lives hung suspended. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Manhattan Project was entering its final stage. American physicists worked in feverish secrecy, perfecting the weapon that would change the world. Japan's name was never far from their minds. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not chosen at random. There were cities largely untouched by previous bombings, selected to demonstrate the bomb's power with clarity. The Japanese had intercepted none of this. Their intelligence networks had been crippled, their code breakers overrun, their communications shattered. They were fighting blind. But here is where the story turns darker. In July 1945, Japan's Supreme War Council, the inner circle of the empire's leadership, met to discuss surrender terms. They were aware of America's demands through the Potsdam Declaration. They knew their cities could not withstand more destruction. But one question haunted them. Could they secure better terms by holding out longer? Could they convince the Allies to spare the Emperor, or even negotiate a peace through the Soviet Union? They gambled that time was still on their side. What they didn't know was that time had already run out. The Trinity test in New Mexico had already proven the atomic bomb's existence. The weapon existed, and it worked. Yet as Japan debated diplomacy, its leaders were warned by their few remaining intelligence officers that the Americans were planning something decisive. Still, the military refused to yield. They clung to the dream of one last decisive battle, defense of the homeland, the final stand that would force negotiation. In those underground chambers, pride was stronger than reason. That pride was the empire's last secret and its greatest curse. When Hiroshima vanished on August 6, the Japanese high command was paralyzed. For hours, no one could understand what had happened. Communication with the city ceased. A strange flash followed by silence. Planes sent to investigate reported a black cloud rising into the sky and a city burning beneath it. At first, Tokyo's military analysts believed it was a massive conventional bombing with incendiaries. But when reports came of radiation sickness, of shadows burned into walls, and of a single bomb destroying everything, it was too much to believe. Only when President Truman announced the use of an atomic bomb, the Japanese leaders finally confront the truth they had feared to acknowledge. Physicist Yoshio Nishina was immediately summoned to Hiroshima. What he saw confirmed his deepest fear. He returned to Tokyo pale and silent, whispering to his colleagues, it was atomic. For years, he had tried to warn them that such a weapon was possible, but now it was too late. The empire's scientists understood the science, but their leaders had not understood the meaning. In the days that followed, a silence heavier than grief fell across Japan. The government hesitated again. Some believe the Americans cannot possibly have more than one bomb. They hope to endure, to fight one last battle. But then 3 days later, Nagasaki vanished. And with it, all illusions. The empire's last secret, the belief that courage could defeat science, was finally broken. And yet buried deep within this tragedy lies another secret, one history often overlooks. After the war, Allied investigators discovered evidence that Japan's scientists had in fact been conducting nuclear experiments of their own. In the ruins of universities, laboratories, and caves, they found traces of uranium research, abandoned reactors, and notebooks describing fission reactions. It seemed that Japan had known the truth all along, that they had glimpsed the power of the atom, but lacked the resources and unity to realize it. The empire's greatest mistake was not that it didn't know, but that it refused to believe.
This is where the story truly begins, in the shadow between knowledge and denial, science and superstition, pride and survival. For the Japanese Empire, the atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a mirror. It showed them what they had become and what they could never be again. In the ruins of Tokyo, among twisted steel and shattered glass, the war's end brought not peace, but revelation. American occupation forces, led by scientific intelligence teams known as ALSOS and Manhattan District investigators, swept through Japan's universities, factories, and military archives, searching for any trace of nuclear research. What they found painted a haunting picture of ambition strangled by chaos. Japan had not been blind to atomic science, it had simply been too late. At the Riken Institute, once the pride of Japan's scientific community, Allied officers discovered fragments of laboratory equipment, charred papers, and empty uranium containers. Physicist Yoshio Nishina, the same man who had examined Hiroshima, met them in person. Thin, exhausted, and visibly aged, he admitted that his team had studied uranium separation and fission chain reactions as early as 1940. They had even attempted to construct a small cyclotron to accelerate particles and measure nuclear reactions. "We understood the principle," he said softly, "but we did not have the materials. We did not have the time." Across the sea in occupied Korea, Another discovery stunned investigators. In Konan, now Hamhung, North Korea, Japanese scientists working under the Navy had been conducting their own uranium research. The site was primitive but ambitious. Tunnels carved into mountains, hidden laboratories, and reports of uranium oxide shipments arriving from Manchuria. When Soviet forces swept into Korea in August 1945, they captured many of these scientists and took the equipment north. To this day, historians debate what the Soviets found there. Some claim it was merely experimental. Others whisper that a crude device had been under construction. It was not just rumor. In September 1945, a Japanese journalist named David Snell, stationed in Korea, published an explosive report in the Atlantic Constitution. He claimed that Japan had successfully tested a small atomic device near Konan just days before the war ended. According to Snell, a Japanese officer had told him, "We were ready to use it, but the war ended before we could." The story spread like wildfire, feeding a legend, the idea that Japan had been closer to the bomb than anyone knew. But historians have never found proof. No photographs, no surviving blueprints, no radiation traces. Still, the myth persists, echoing through history like a whisper in the ruins. The truth is more tragic and more human. Japan's atomic program, divided between the Army's NIGO project and the Navy's FGO effort, was crippled by rivalry, secrecy, and shortages. Scientists worked in isolation, rarely communicating. The Army distrusted academics, fearing spies or defeatism. Resources that could have funded laboratories were instead poured into kamikaze planes and coastal defenses. The very culture of the empire, loyalty, hierarchy, secrecy, ensured its downfall. Brilliant men like Nishina were trapped between duty and reason, unable to convince their superiors that the age of science had already replaced the age of swords. Still, some among the military elite sensed the truth. In the final months of the war, fragments of intelligence from Germany reached Japan. They learned of the German atomic project led by Werner Heisenberg and the Allied bombing of German heavy water plants in Norway. They knew that Berlin had failed to create a weapon before its collapse, but they also knew that the Americans had inherited that research. One cable sent from the Japanese embassy in Berlin in early 1945 read, "America now possesses materials and facilities to complete atomic explosives soon." Yet, even with this warning, the Japanese War Cabinet refused to change course. Why? Pride. Pride in the samurai tradition, pride in the empire's divine mission, pride in the illusion that willpower could defeat science. It was this cultural blindfold that sealed their fate. The emperor's generals still spoke of honor, of death before surrender, of the spirit that would outlast steel. They believed the Americans were too soft, too unwilling to sacrifice millions of men. They believed wrong. In one chilling account recorded after the war, a former member of Japan's general staff recalled hearing about the bomb just weeks before Hiroshima. He said, "We had reports from Europe, but they were unbelievable. We thought no man could create such power. We thought it was a bluff." That disbelief was the empire's undoing. When Hiroshima was destroyed, physicist Yoshio Nishina wept not just for the victims, but for what it meant, that science had triumphed where spirit failed. For decades, he had been a bridge between Japan and the Western scientific world. He had studied under Niels Bohr, exchanged letters with Einstein, and warned Tokyo of the coming atomic age. But no one listened. After the war, when Allied officers questioned him, Nishina's words carried quiet sorrow. "We could have known. We should have known." In the aftermath, American intelligence pieced together the fragments of Japan's atomic effort. They found that Japan's scientists had experimented with uranium hexafluoride, a critical step in isotope separation. They discovered calculations predicting the critical mass needed for fission, remarkably accurate. And they confirmed that Japan's Navy had ordered large quantities of uranium ore from occupied territories in Asia. But they also found evidence of collapse, of experiments halted by bombing, of laboratories destroyed, of laboratories reduced to rubble. Japan had walked toward the atomic age, but the war had torn out the road beneath its feet. And then there was another layer, one almost lost to time. In 1943, a Japanese submarine left port carrying diplomats, blueprints, and scientific data bound for Nazi Germany. It was part of a desperate exchange between Axis powers. The Japanese wanted advanced radar, jet engine technology, and information about atomic research. The Germans wanted rubber, tin, and rare metals. But most of those submarines never made it. Allied destroyers hunted them down across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans. Among the wreckage, lost forever, may have been the empire's last hope for scientific parity, and its last chance to understand the weapon that would end its existence. After the surrender, as Allied scientists examined the fragments of Japan's atomic effort, they realized something chilling. Japan had been pursuing nuclear weapons not to win the war, but to prevent defeat. The plan, if successful, was to create a single atomic device that could be used defensively, to strike an invading fleet or annihilate an Allied beachhead during the anticipated invasion of Kyushu. It was desperation, not ambition, that fueled the effort. The empire was already collapsing, but still dreaming of miracles. As occupation forces settled into Tokyo, the Japanese scientific community entered a new silence. Many of the surviving researchers were interrogated, their work confiscated, their papers classified. Some would later rebuild Japan's post-war industries and universities. Others would fade into obscurity. But all of them carried the same burden, the knowledge that they had glimpsed the dawn of a terrible new age, and that their country had stood helpless before it. Behind closed doors, the emperor himself was briefed on the bomb. In a rare moment of candor, Emperor Hirohito reportedly asked one of his advisors, "Could we have built such a thing?" And the answer was quiet. "We understood the science, but not the scale." In that moment, the emperor realized what his generals had refused to see, that Japan's war had never been winnable, not because of lack of courage, but because the world had changed, and Japan had not. And so the empire's last secret was not hidden in mountains or laboratories. It was buried in belief, in the refusal to see that the age of the samurai had ended and the age of science had begun. The bomb did not just destroy cities, it destroyed illusions. It shattered the idea that bravery alone could defy progress, that honor could outweigh physics. It forced Japan and the world to face a truth that was both terrifying and divine, that humanity had finally mastered the power to unmake itself. As American officers filed their final reports and scientists returned home, many carried a strange respect for their former enemy. The Japanese had fought fiercely, yes, but their downfall had not been ignorance. It had been conviction, pride, and faith in a fading world. The empire had seen the storm coming, but believed their spirit could withstand it. And when the storm arrived, it did not just end a war, it ended an age.
The war had ended, but in Japan, silence ruled more powerfully than peace. Cities lay in ruins, but beneath the ashes, secrets still breathed. The imperial government had fallen, but not all its records. Some were burned by loyal officers in the final hours before surrender. Others were sealed away in temples, attics, or buried underground, awaiting a future that might never come. What Japan knew about the atomic bomb and what it chose to hide became a question that haunted the post-war years. When the emperor's voice echoed across the radio on August 15, 1945, many soldiers did not believe it was real. The dual voice broadcast, as it would later be known, was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard Hirohito speak. His words were poetic, indirect, heavy with imperial grace. He did not say surrender. He said, "We must endure the unendurable." And in that poetic restraint, a nation that had fought for glory found itself adrift in defeat. But behind those elegant words, a truth lingered. The emperor's decision had been shaped not by spirit, but by science. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's top surviving military and political leaders convened in a secret imperial conference. Minutes from that meeting, later declassified, revealed the emotional collapse of an empire. Some generals insisted Japan should fight on, believing the United States could not possibly possess more than 1 or 2 atomic bombs. Others argued that surrender was inevitable. The destruction of Hiroshima was not a weapon, they said, but an apocalypse. General Anami Korechika, the Minister of War, remained silent for much of the meeting, torn between loyalty and reality. When the emperor finally spoke, he broke centuries of imperial tradition by intervening directly in a military debate. "If we continue to fight," he said, "it will mean the annihilation of the Japanese people." It was the atomic bomb, not the invasion threat, not the Soviet entry into the war,
that forced the emperor's hand. And yet, even as he spoke of peace, a darker reality unfolded. Japan's scientists already knew what had happened. Within hours of the Hiroshima blast, Yoshio Nishina had confirmed that the city's destruction was caused by nuclear fission. He had analyzed radiation, debris, and soil samples. He knew this was no conventional bomb. In a report sent quietly to Tokyo, Nishina wrote, "The weapon used is atomic in nature. It is beyond any force humanity has known." That report was read by Japan's remaining ministers before the emperor made his fateful choice. The bomb, not diplomacy, ended the war. But the empire did not confess everything. When the Allied occupation began, General Douglas MacArthur ordered the systematic seizure of all scientific documents, military archives, and research materials related to advanced weapons. Teams of American intelligence officers raided universities, factories, and government offices. Thousands of pages were boxed and shipped to the United States. The goal was simple: ensure that Japan would never again possess the means to wage scientific war. But among those papers, some were missing, and some had been deliberately erased. Years later, Japanese researchers would whisper of Project Nigo and Project EFGO, the twin atomic programs of the Army and Navy, as if they were ghosts. Many of the surviving scientists refused to speak publicly, citing loyalty oaths or fear of disgrace. It was not until decades later that fragments of their work resurfaced. In a locked storeroom at the University of Tokyo, hidden behind a wall of old equipment, archivists discovered several notebooks belonging to Nishina's laboratory. The handwriting was faded but legible. Equations, sketches of cyclotron parts, notes about isotope separation, and even references to uranium hexafluoride, proof that Japan had pursued the same processes as the Americans. The difference was scale. The Japanese had knowledge, but not power. Meanwhile, in Washington, the narrative took on a simpler form. Japan, the defeated empire, had never stood a chance. But in secret, U.S. intelligence reports painted a more complex picture. Declassified files from the Manhattan Engineer District acknowledged that Japan's scientists were highly capable, though fatally undermined by wartime chaos. One report stated, "Had Japan's resources not been diverted by the demands of total war, her progress in atomic research might have been significant." It was a chilling admission that the line between victors and victims in the atomic race had been thinner than history suggests. And then there were the mysteries no one could quite explain. When Soviet forces captured the city of Konan in Korea, they reportedly found underground laboratories, test tunnels, and several Japanese scientists. Soviet intelligence quickly sealed off the area. For years afterward, no Western observer was allowed to enter. Rumors spread that the Soviets had taken Japan's atomic data, that those scientists had been transported to Moscow, that their research had contributed to the Soviet nuclear program that would detonate its first bomb in 1949. None of these claims were proven, but neither were they disproven. The empire's knowledge had not died with the emperor. It had simply changed masters. Back in Japan, the surviving scientists tried to rebuild their lives under the new constitution and the shadow of defeat. Yoshio Nishina returned to teaching and helped establish Japan's post-war scientific foundations. His students would go on to lead the country's peaceful nuclear energy program decades later, but he rarely spoke of the war. Once, when asked by a young journalist whether Japan could have built its own bomb, he paused for a long time before answering. "Perhaps," he said, quietly, "but it would have cost us our soul." That single line captures what history often forgets. Japan's defeat was not only military, but moral. The empire's leaders had gambled on spirit over reason, pride over progress. And when faced with a weapon that defied imagination, they were forced to confront their own blindness. Yet even in defeat, they preserved their dignity by controlling the narrative. The atomic bomb, in Japan's official memory, became a tragedy inflicted upon the innocent, not a reckoning for imperial aggression. It was easier to mourn than to reflect. Still, there were those who remembered the truth, that Japan's scientists had peered into the same abyss as their enemies, that they had sought power too great for any nation to hold. After the occupation ended, a few of these men gathered in private, reflecting on what might have been. In one recorded conversation, later released to historians, a physicist named Bunsaku Arakatsu said, "We stood on the threshold of creation, but we were also standing on the edge of ruin. We did not understand how close we were to both." For the next half-century, that duality defined Japan's relationship with the atomic bomb, both victim and near participant, both witness and almost creator. School children were taught of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as symbols of suffering and peace. The scientists who once chased the atom's power were recast as humble scholars who had renounced destruction. The empire's last secret, that Japan had sought the same terrible knowledge, faded into myth. But the past has a way of resurfacing. In the 1990s, declassified American documents reignited debate. They confirmed that Japan's atomic experiments had been more advanced than once thought. They revealed communication between Tokyo and Berlin discussing uranium weapons and the power of the new physics. They even mentioned a shipment of uranium oxide intercepted by Allied forces in 1945 aboard a German submarine bound for Japan. It was enough to raise a haunting question. Had Japan received that uranium, could history have taken a darker turn? The answer lies not only in science, but in culture. Japan's empire was built on obedience, sacrifice, and belief in destiny. The atomic bomb required something the empire lacked: collaboration, trust in open inquiry, and the humility to question authority. That was the real secret. The empire did not fail because it lacked intelligence. It failed because it could not adapt. The same virtues that once made Japan strong, discipline, loyalty, devotion, became chains that bound it to the past. By 1946, as Tokyo's streets filled again with laughter and rebuilding, the last embers of the old empire faded into history. The laboratories were silent, the soldiers gone, the emperor humanized. But the shadow of what Japan had known and what it had almost unleashed remained. Beneath the surface of peace, the empire's final secret still whispered that the path to power and the path to ruin often begin with the same idea: the belief that one can control the atom or destiny itself.
The war was over, but the shadows it cast never truly faded. Japan had surrendered, its empire dismantled, its emperor no longer divine. Yet deep beneath the surface, questions still burned, questions the world was not ready to ask. How much had Japan known about the atomic bomb before Hiroshima? And what did that knowledge mean for the way history was written afterward? The years following 1945 were a strange twilight for Japan. Cities once reduced to ash now hummed with rebuilding. The occupation under General Douglas MacArthur brought sweeping reforms, democracy, disarmament, education, but it also brought silence. The American occupation authorities tightly controlled narratives about the war. Reports of Japanese atomic research were confiscated, scientists were interrogated, and documents were classified. Anything that hinted Japan had been working toward the bomb was quietly removed from public view. The victors needed a clear story. America had the bomb, Japan did not. One side wielded ultimate power, the other submitted to it. The truth, as always, was more complicated. For years, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were discouraged from speaking publicly. Photographs were censored. Reports of radiation sickness were minimized or dismissed. It was as if the bomb itself had to remain a mystery, a godlike weapon beyond comprehension, belonging only to those who had used it. But while the world debated morality, a handful of Japanese scientists were living with a deeper, more personal guilt. They understood what had happened not just as victims, but as witnesses to the science behind it.
Yoshino Nishina, Japan's leading physicist and head of the wartime atomic project, was one of them. In the ruins of Tokyo, his laboratory had survived just enough for him to start again. Under American supervision, he rebuilt the foundations of Japan's modern scientific community, training a new generation of researchers in nuclear physics. But he carried a heavy silence. He had seen the results of Hiroshima firsthand and confirmed its atomic nature within hours. He had written the report that shaped the emperor's decision to surrender. Yet, when asked later about Japan's own nuclear ambitions, Nishina simply replied, "Science must never again serve destruction." But even as Japan turned toward peace, fragments of its wartime past began to re-emerge. Historians in the 1950s and 60s uncovered traces of the Army's secret NIGO project and the Navy's FGO project, two parallel efforts to unlock atomic energy before the war's end. The Army's program, run by Nishina under the Imperial Army Scientific Research Institute, had focused on building a small cyclotron to separate uranium isotopes. The Navy's version, led by scientists like Bunsaku Arakatsu, explored alternative methods such as thermal diffusion and heavy water reactors. Neither had the resources to succeed. Japan lacked uranium, electricity, and industrial stability. But both demonstrated one chilling fact: Japan knew exactly what an atomic bomb was. And then there were the accounts from Manchuria and Korea. After the war, Soviet intelligence captured several Japanese scientists in the city of Gonan, now Hamhung, North Korea. For decades, rumors swirled that Japan had attempted a small-scale atomic test there in August 1945, just days before the war ended. Western historians dismissed it as Soviet propaganda, but when the Cold War archives opened in the 1990s, documents confirmed that the Soviets had indeed seized a laboratory complex in Gonan, complete with experimental facilities and radiation shielding. Whether a test occurred or not remains uncertain, but it revealed something undeniable. The empire's pursuit of nuclear power had reached deeper into Asia than anyone had known. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to unearth secrets of their own. Operation Alsos, the Allied intelligence mission to track enemy scientific progress, had gathered evidence that both Germany and Japan were pursuing atomic research, though neither had come close to producing a weapon. Yet in their reports, the Americans noted something remarkable. Japanese scientists had a sophisticated understanding of atomic theory and experimental design. The limitation was not knowledge, but infrastructure. Japan's cities were bombed to rubble, its supply chain severed, and its military leadership obsessed with spiritual will over scientific reality. That was the empire's fatal flaw. It understood the atom, but it refused to understand itself. By the 1960s, the atomic bomb had become the cornerstone of Japan's national trauma and its rebirth. The cities that once suffered annihilation became centers for peace movements and scientific innovation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were rebuilt not as symbols of vengeance, but as reminders of humanity's shared vulnerability. Every August when bells tolled in Hiroshima Peace Park, survivors spoke not of hate, but of warning. Never again, they said. And yet, even as Japan became the world's advocate for disarmament, it quietly re-entered the nuclear age, this time in pursuit of energy, not weapons. Under U.S. guidance, Japan developed one of the most advanced civilian nuclear programs in the world. The irony was striking. The nation once devastated by the atom now harnessed it to power its cities. But behind the scenes, whispers persisted. American archives revealed that the U.S. had monitored Japan's nuclear research closely throughout the 1950s, ensuring it stayed peaceful. Yet Japanese engineers and physicists often admitted off-record that their country had the technical capability to build a bomb if it ever chose to. "We do not need to possess it," one official said. "We only need to know that we could." That quiet confidence was the last echo of the empire's secret, the same intellectual spark that had flickered during the war, now reborn in peace. It wasn't just about science anymore. It was about identity. The Japanese people had seen what happens when a nation worships power. They had lived through the burning skies and the blinding light. Now they sought balance, mastery without madness, progress without pride. But the ghost of the past never stayed buried for long.
In the 1980s, a series of interviews with elderly wartime scientists reopened the question of what Japan truly knew about the bomb. One of them, a retired physicist named Tatusaburo Suzuki, recalled being ordered in 1944 to analyze uranium samples for potential weaponization. He claimed the project had been rushed, underfunded, and doomed by bureaucracy. He said, "We had brilliant minds, but no unity. We were soldiers with slide rules, not generals with vision." His words captured the tragic essence of Japan's scientific effort: brilliance without direction, ambition without understanding. The empire had dreamed of mastery over the Pacific, but the atomic bomb revealed a truth it could not escape. Power without wisdom destroys itself. When Hiroshima vanished in one flash, the empire's vision of divine destiny collapsed with it. And yet there was a bitter irony. Japan's scientists had foreseen such a weapon years earlier. They had studied Einstein, Bohr, Fermi. They had read about uranium fission in 1939 and warned their superiors that the atom's energy could change warfare forever. But their warnings were ignored. The generals laughed. "We fight with spirit," they said, "not with foreign science." That arrogance was the empire's true undoing. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of resources, but an inability to see beyond its own myth. The one mistake that doomed Japan's empire was not Pearl Harbor, nor Midway, nor even Hiroshima. It was the refusal to believe that the modern world had changed. While Japan chased divine wind, the Allies built the storm. By the dawn of the 21st century, historians began to piece together the empire's final puzzle. Newly released archives from Japan, the United States, and Russia revealed that Japanese intelligence had indeed intercepted reports of the Manhattan Project through diplomatic channels in 1944. They knew the Americans were developing a new extraordinary weapon. Some in Tokyo dismissed it as disinformation, others took it seriously, but could do nothing. One scientist, in a memo discovered decades later, wrote, "If they succeed, the war is already lost." He was right, but no one listened. Today, the legacy of that silence lives on. Japan stands as a peaceful power, its constitution renouncing war, its people committed to peace. But beneath the surface of its pacifism lies a deep, uneasy respect for the atom, a recognition that the line between creation and destruction is vanishingly thin. The same country that once sought to master nuclear power for conquest now uses it to illuminate cities, drive innovation, and warn humanity of its own potential for ruin. And so the empire's last secret is not just what Japan knew about the bomb, it is what the bomb taught Japan about itself. That science without conscience leads to tragedy. That knowledge, if not guided by humility, can destroy the very civilization it seeks to elevate. And perhaps most hauntingly, that the moment humanity learns to harness the ultimate power, it must also learn to restrain it. When the bells ring August in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they do not only mourn the dead. They remind the living that knowledge is never innocent. Japanese scientists once gazed into the atom's heart and saw the future. What they didn't see, what no one could, was that the same light that could power the world could also end it. In the quiet reflection pools of Hiroshima, where the names of the lost shimmer beneath the surface, one inscription captures the essence of Japan's final reckoning. "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the evil." It is both an apology and a vow, a promise that the empire's last secret, now revealed, will serve not as a weapon, but as a warning. For Japan, the lesson of the atomic age is eternal.